Welcome to our K Festival again. My name is Ayobami Adebayo, and I'll be hosting this book chat with Helon Habila. Before we go on, I just have to say what an incredible honor it is to be sitting here. I remember the first time I read a book by Helon Habila. The first one I read was Measuring Time, and it was because a friend of mine just would not stop talking about this book. It was like he read it, and it was like everybody around him had to read it. And by the time I picked it up and read it, the wonderful thing was that I could then go back to Waiting for an Angel. Does anybody know what it feels like when you discover a writer who has a backlist and then you can you know? So it's such an honor to have you here, sir. So I'm going to start with one question.
It's not working.
Can we have a...
Okay. So thank you for the introduction and your kind words.
So I'm going to start with one question, and then we'll have a bit of a reading from the book, and then we'll continue with the conversation. So Travelers begins in Berlin. It's a fantastic book. If you haven't gotten your copy, they probably still have some. You should get yours. And it's subdivided into 6 sections. And the first section is titled A Year in Berlin. And you were the recipient of the prestigious Dart Fellowship, and you had a year in Berlin. So I'm curious about whether you went to Berlin wanting to write about Berlin, or wanted to set a book in Berlin. Was this the book you were thinking about writing at the time?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for the support. Thanks for being at RK. I think the conversation level here is quite different from anywhere else, you know, in the world. People keep it real here. If they don't like your book, they tell you your book is shit. But yeah, it's great to be here. So, back to Travelers. Was I in Berlin to write this particular book? No, I actually went to write a different book. So my fellowship is called the DAAD Fellowship. They give you 1 year in Berlin, basically to write whatever you want to write. So there's no restriction. In fact, you don't even have to write anything. It's not as if they will check to see if you're writing, all that. But it so happened that, I mean, I can say that the book almost fell into my lap, the stories. When I got to Berlin in 2013, if you can remember, this was when the migration crisis was just like picking up, 2013. The year I got to Berlin, a boat had capsized in the Mediterranean and over 300 migrants had died. It was a big tragedy off the coast of Lampedusa in Italy. And I was invited by a German newspaper, I think it's called the Freitag, that's their name. They wanted me to write an essay about it. They wanted to hear from an African perspective, basically. So I started researching, you know, reading, interviewing people, and I wrote my article. But this is, you know, it's so important and so topical that once you start interacting with that subject matter, you can't pull back. You can't turn the gaze away from it. So that's really what caught me. And then I thought, you know, I should write a book about this. Because the way it's covered in the papers, in the media, it's always flat. You know, they just present one aspect of it, maybe in one column, a few minutes on TV, and they always show the bad side of it. Basically, these people are migrants. They're just statistics. And so I thought maybe if I talk to these people from the stories that they were telling me, I'll be able to show them in their totality as human beings, not just as migrants. And that's really how the book started. So I interviewed a lot of people. In fact, most of the stories in the book are actual stories that were told to me. And I had to, afterwards, you know, tweak it and structure it so that it becomes an interesting story. Because at the end of the day, I'm not writing a an essay or an article, I'm writing a story, and it has to be interesting. So those were the changes I made, but all the interviews, all the stories are based on interviews that I carried out with people.
Okay. So you already talked about your work as a journalist, and I'm just going to pivot a bit to that and ask, I'm always curious about this with writers who write across genres in a sense. I mean, your last book, your fourth book, was Chibok Girls, and that was nonfiction. How and why did you decide to write this as a novel and not, say, a nonfiction book, or what was that imperative?
Yeah, so with the Chibok Girls, I knew immediately that I wanted to write a nonfiction book. You know, there was no two way about it. I wanted to be direct, I wanted to be unambiguous, and I wanted to kind of say what was on my mind, you know, as immediately as possible. And I knew that the best way to do that was to write a nonfiction book, based on interviews as well, because I traveled, I went to Maiduguri and Chibok and all that, and I tried to present their words the way they told me, you know, with little kind of intercession from me. So basically that's what I did with that book, direct approach. But with Travelers, even though the subject is as traumatic, it's as serious, it's as topical, I felt immediately that I wanted to go beyond a nonfiction book. And you could also say that I was sort of exhausted at that time. Writing a nonfiction book is not easy. Those of you who do nonfiction books, I congratulate you. Basically, you are studying every book that has been written on that subject. You know, you have to cross-check your facts. You can't make a mistake because, you know, you can be called out for it. But with Travelers, I didn't want that. I didn't want to have to do all that kind of research. But I think you can do more with a story than with nonfiction, because then you can show character, you know, in a way that you cannot do in nonfiction. Let me give you an example. When I met the Somalian character in my book, and I wanted to interview him, and I went there, I didn't have my tape recorder, because I wasn't sure how he would take it. If I brought out a recorder, I wanted to, you know, you don't want to spook him. So we started talking, and he was telling me about how he left Somalia and all that. And after 5 minutes, he was like, "Don't you want to record this? Where's your recorder?" I said, "Okay." So I brought out my recorder, started recording it. So I realized that for him, it's important that I understood the story and I record it and I write about it. He wanted me to see him the way he saw himself, not just the way society or statistics or the TV or whatever sees him. So I think stories have a kind of power. They humanize, because the institution, to be a refugee, one thing it does is it dehumanizes you, depersonalizes you. So the only way you can bring back somebody's humanity, one of the best ways that I know of, is through stories. That's why stories have such currency. From the beginning of time, we'll always listen to stories because it tells us more about human beings. So if I could present him not just as a statistic, but as a father, because he told me that he left Somalia because somebody wanted to marry his 10-year-old daughter. So he had to escape, either to stay and get his daughter married to this crazy warlord, or to escape with her. So he saw himself as a father who sacrificed so much for his daughter, and that's what he wanted me to represent. And you have to do it through story so that you can see him beyond what he is in Berlin. Yeah.
And I mean, what you just talked about is one of the fantastic things about the book, is that there are all these different migrant experiences. It's not just this monolithic, oh yeah, they're migrants and they're refugees and they're all in this camp. It's that by the time you're done with this book, you see that there's an individual story, that there's always more than the headline, which is what this book does. But I had a quick question before we go back to talk about that again. It's that the relationship that you developed with the actual people that you interviewed, did it liberate you to write this fiction, or did you feel, because this is coming from actual people, did you feel any kind of trepidation because of that? As, I mean, thinking about the other books that you've done that weren't necessarily in that mode.
Yeah, I mean, you have to be careful when people entrust you with their stories. You want to do justice to it. You don't want to misrepresent them, especially when it's such sensitive and serious matter. So that was one of the challenges that I faced in writing the book. So I had done the interview, and like I told you, they just fell into my lap. Some of them I didn't even plan. For instance, there's a chapter in Basel, set in Basel. So I was in Switzerland, and I was giving a reading, and afterwards, this lady came up to me, this Swiss lady with her blonde hair and blue eyes, and she told me that, I have a story for you. You know, I met a migrant and I married him, and I think it's an interesting story. Would you like to hear it? And she told me her story, and we became very good friends. This is a lady with a PhD. She's a pastor. She has a PhD in divinity, but she married this migrant. And eventually the marriage kind of didn't work out, but she has her story, and she felt that, I should be able to tell it. So I have all these stories by these people. Now, how do I convert it to fiction? So I made the first draft, and I actually had to send them drafts for them to read, and to tell me if they're okay with it, if they think I've represented them, honestly and seriously enough. And none of them was unhappy with it, let me put it that way. They were all happy with it, especially her, because if you read the book, you will see what I make her do in that section. I make her do something terrible. And she told me, why do you make me do that bad thing?
Okay, so she doesn't actually do that. No. Okay, you have to read the book together.
Yeah, I told her it's all because it has to work. I have to find a plot. I have to make it a story. I have to make it interesting. So, but she's happy with it.
Okay, so the real characters themselves were happy with you taking those artistic liberties.
Correct.
Okay.
But it's and I don't want it to sound kind of simplistic. It's not as if I just took these interviews and I put them in a book, I had to invent the idiom, the mannerisms of speech, everything. I had to, it's a process of translation. So they're telling me their stories, they are translating for themselves what happened to them. And I'm listening and I'm writing, I'm also translating for the reader. Yeah. So there's this kind of layers of interpretation and translations. And by the end of it, everything changes, You have to bring the images, the setting, everything changes. You defamiliarize and you distance and all that.
Yes.
So it's not as easy as it sounds, but basically that's
yes. So I mean, it's that you've inspired by these people, created different characters on the page.
Correct.
And I'm curious about, because from Manu, who's the Libyan doctor who becomes a bouncer in Berlin, through Karim, the Somalian man, to even James Carrico's character, who we get a bit of through his letters in the book. You have this disparate experiences and relationships between home and exile. It's not the same story that you find in an headline. And I wondered what your thoughts were, if there was any guiding sort of overhacking sense in terms of choosing which stories you wanted. And it was one of the things I loved about the book, that it's very complicated. These people have complicated relationships with the places they once called home, with the places where they are now. Some of them are even still in motion, in a sense.
Yeah, so there's a reason why I call it travelers. I didn't call it
refugees
or migrants and all that, because I know there's so much politics, and these words have become kind of over-politicized, and sometimes they're used in a pejorative sense to reduce people to one category, which is the whole politics of travel. A black person traveling is not the same as a white person traveling. Sometimes the very passport you hold sort of seems to determine your humanity. It's almost as if you're not a human being because you have a Nigerian passport.
A green passport.
The same person would have an American passport. They'll give you a red carpet. You have a Nigerian passport, they'll tell you, step this way, sir. So there's that. So I wanted to kind of represent the totality of the travel experience. We travel for different reasons, but we all have to travel eventually. So I have people who travel as students. The main character is a PhD student in the US. Then you have the poet I just mentioned, James Carrico, who is in exile from his country, Zambia. and you have others who are traveling to look for people who have traveled. So there's all this totality of travel. But one thing that I realize is that they all have something in common. They all suffer from a loss of their home, They have to sacrifice some things to travel. And when they get to where they're going to, eventually they have to cope with having to translate themselves into this new home. They have to reinvent themselves. So these are the commonalities that I notice in my theme, and I kind of keep coming back to these things as a refrain, as a thematic constant that keeps recurring in all the stories. Of course, we don't all react in the same way. Some experience more trauma when they travel. Some are able to fit in more easily than others. But generally, what I've discovered in my research is that there are two extremes of behavior when people migrate or they travel. So there are those who don't want to hear about their home countries once they leave home. They hate their countries. It's like they would never come back. They don't want to hear you talk about it. Everything about it is bad. Then there are people who go and they can't stop thinking about their countries. They can't even make a life in the new place because they are so nostalgic, they miss home and all that. And in a way, both behaviors are a kind of coping mechanism. They are trying to cope with a loss of home. So it's called dissociative mechanism, They're trying to dissociate. They are not behaving normally. They're being extreme in other direction. But the thing is, if you can be somewhere in the middle and know that you have lost your home and still try to cope, that would be more normal. But in most cases, it's the extreme. So James Kariuku, for instance, is an example of that, who doesn't even want to come home, left his family, doesn't want to hear about his children or his wife, and his daughter is looking for him. So is that example of that extreme.
Yes. You spoke just now about the experience, how it's different for a black person traveling and, say, the kind of passport you carry. And one of the things that I found with this book that I think it also examines is what it means, the relationship of the black body to Europe, being a black person in Europe, existing in Europe as a black person. Because the narrator, the central character in the novel, at the beginning of the novel, he seems insulated from all of this, right? Is here with his wife who has a prestigious fellowship. He's doing a PhD program. So, it's a kind of, black person who can sort of move through the world, who can move through the world in a certain way. Yeah. And by the end of that, I don't want to give spoilers. By the end of the novel, you realize that can't really insulate you.
Yep. Yeah, that's the point I was trying to make in the book. There's the fallacy about the good migrant, model minority or ever model migrant, and sometimes it's used to kind of divide the same people, so that these are better migrants than you. It's all politics, At the end of the day, you face the same thing. You get stopped by the same policeman, whether you have a PhD or not. All he sees is your skin color. It's like saying I'm O.J. Simpson, I'm not a black person, I'm O.J. Simpson, but you end up in prison, at the end of it. So that's what I was trying to show. And to go back to the idea of this, there's an essay I read, I think it's an interview with some African writers, and the question was how they cope, with racism and all that. And one of them, I think, said that he never experiences it, because he's super educated and he is, he has this presence. I said, okay. Knock on wood. Hope it never happens to you.
Really? Okay.
But that's the reality.
Okay, so this is a novel that is replete with all kinds of allusions. It's gore allusions to poetry, allusions to other novels. The last section, sorry, I don't want to call it
last book.
The last book is called Hunger, and very directly alludes to that particular book. And I think the previous two made allusions to Banville and Shoyinka's titles. And I was curious about what art forms and writers you were thinking with or reading or thinking about while you were working on this book?
Yeah. One thing we're writing about travel is that it's such a perfect metaphor, for the human condition, because we all have to travel. Doesn't matter whether we're white or from the West or from here, we all have to travel. And a lot has been written about travel over the years. Basically, when you look at all the foundational literatures of the world, they all have some aspect of travel in them. So whether you go back to Homer's Iliad or the Odyssey, it's about travel, When you look at all the colonial explorers' narratives, it's about travel. But what makes some forms of travel different from others, like I said, is that some forms are more accepted, they're more privileged. So when the Greeks in the Iliad set out to go and conquer Troy, they are heroes. They travel, they are heroes, who celebrate them. When the colonial masters came to Africa, they came to explore and to conquer. They are heroes. But when we go there, we're migrants, we're refugees. So there's all these aspects, the politics of travel. So for me, writing the book, I didn't have to reinvent the tropes and the ideas behind travel. All I had to do was to choose what worked for me and to look at different models. So I made references, like you said, to all these books and poems, especially poems. I used a lot of allusions to poetry. One of them is, let me choose anyone at random. Matthew Arnold, Dover Beach, and a character who is in Calais in France is looking across the water from France to the coast of England, Dover. And he's thinking of Matthew Arnold's on Dover Beach, and he's thinking of how in the poem, a character in England is looking the other way at France and thinking about the confusion and the end of whatever, the Christian age, and sense of loneliness and all that. So I try to imagine it from the eyes of this person who is hoping to get to England and he can see the lights of Dover, and he's thinking of that poem. And he's talking, the line he quotes is that there's an eternal note of sadness, So I'm just kind of trying to juxtapose that. Then you have, I also alluded to T.S. Eliot when he talks about, when he quotes Dante, Dante's Inferno. I didn't know that death had undone so many. So I'm just thinking about all the bodies in the Mediterranean, how much death had undone. You don't know the number, just like countless bodies. In Hunger by Kano Thompson. The book is about an author who is very hungry, can't get any money, can't get any food. So I'm alluding to hunger because my character in this book is on a hunger strike because he's going to be deported back to Nigeria and he refuses to eat so that he can protest. And hunger then becomes the metaphor I'm talking about here. What do you do to a person who refuses to eat? Who is willing to die, because of what he believes in? There's really nothing you can do to him. Because the ultimate fear is death. So this person says, I'm willing to die because I believe in this thing. What else can you do to him? And by the way, that's based on a real story. A Nigerian who was on hunger strike for almost 100 days in the UK. And they tried to deport him. They chartered a plane and brought him to Nigeria, and the Nigerian government refused to let the plane land, and they had to take him back to England. So that's part of the story.
So I'm going to pivot from 2 points that you made. You were talking about the designations, the colonialist who's coming is an explorer, discovering new territory. But when we travel, you're a migrant. And even now, a white person living in Lagos is an expatriate,
Yep.
So, and you are living in America, you're a migrant. And there are all these distinctions and designations. And one of the very interesting things for me at the beginning of the book is that you have Gina and the central character, who's her husband. And she's in Berlin. She's an American. She's in Berlin on this prestigious fellowship. And very quickly it becomes apparent that they both have different relationships to the city, because he's Nigerian, who's been in America for quite a while. And then to come to what happens with Dovovich, with the character, I think he's Afghan, who's looking, and you sort of flip the gaze from Arnold looking across to this character looking the other way. And there was this bit at the beginning of the book, if you don't mind, I'll just, you haven't read. My God, I'm so sorry. Okay, we're going to stop and you are going to read. Okay. I just got so caught up in the conversation. I was
waiting for you to ask me to read.
Okay, so he's going to read. It's when I was going to read from that, I just remembered. So he's going to read from the book, then I'll ask that question.
Okay, is there any place you want me to read from, or I can just do whatever I want? Yeah. So this is from book 2. It's about the Libyan-Nigerian character who lost his wife in the Mediterranean. The boat sank, and he doesn't know where his wife and his daughter and his son are, but he is with his daughter in Berlin. They got to Berlin. But before they parted with his wife, before they left home, they agreed that if they got to Berlin separately, if anything happened on the way, they should always go to Checkpoint Charlie every Sunday to look for each other, hopefully. So he's a doctor, but now he's working as a bouncer in a nightclub in Berlin. And he meets this German lady, and they form a relationship. And she invites him to come to his house to bring his daughter because she has horses, and if his daughter likes to ride horses. He wonders if Rashida can sense his nervousness, how his steps falter as they approach the front door, how his hand takes an infinitesimally long time to rise to the doorbell. The door opens, and a man stands at the door, a man with a thin, unsmiling face, his hair graying. Manu can tell he isn't that old, mid-50s. He looked at Manu, then at the girl, then back to Manu. Who are you looking for? His voice is challenging. His posture, one hand on his hip, is aggressive. Manu turns to Rashida, unable to hide his confusion. He looks at the house, number 47. Then he says to the man, I think we have the wrong house. Sorry to disturb you. He pulls her hand and they turn to go. As they cross the road, he hears Angela's voice calling, Manu, hey Manu, come back. They take off their muddy shoes by the door. The man is seated behind the piano, running his fingers aimlessly over the keys. He doesn't look up when they enter. Joachim, this is Manu, a friend, and this is Rashida, his daughter, Angela says. She comes forward and frames Rashida's face in her hands, pulling it close, running a hand through her hair. She's so beautiful, Manu. Hello, Joachim, Manu says. Joachim remains bowed over the piano, his back curved over the keyboard, until it seems he's going to tip over. Then he raises his hands, and a tune rings out. It rises and falls, repetitive, rising and falling. Angela leads the girl away. Ma, you are so cold. Come to the kitchen. I'll make you a cocoa. And you, Manu, I'll get you a coffee. The man keeps playing, his head lowered, his eyes closed. Manu sits, feeling the awkwardness of the moment. Joachim is the husband. Angela has mentioned the name several times. He wonders what he's doing, why he's back. His eyes run over the familiar room. Every surface is redolent of him and Angela caught in blind passion, panting and sightless and naked. The piano, she bent over, her hair dripping into the keyboard, he behind her, his hands on her waist, together banging out a sweet and strange tune. He begins to stand up, and just then Joachim turns and says, Charles Mingus. What? Manu asks, smiling. He takes a deep breath to regain his poise, always smiling to show he's harmless. Take the A Train by Charles Mingus, you know it? No, I'm not a musical person. Unfortunately, I'm a doctor. He adds the last with a squaring of his shoulders. But the man interrupts him. Did Angela tell you I'm a musician, jazz? I believe she must have. He continues before Manu can answer. Jazz is like life. You have to trust in chance. Sometimes it will work, sometimes it will not work. It is like sex. When it does work, it is magic. Tell me, does it work for you like that? I'm not a jazz person myself, Manu says. I don't mean jazz. With my wife, the sex, is it magic? Is it chemistry? He has been playing as he talks, but now he stops. Manu turns to the kitchen, hoping Angela will appear. He can hear laughter from the yard outside, coming through the open back door. He hasn't heard Rashida laugh like this in a long time. He stands up. Let me see how my daughter is doing. And just then Angela enters, a cup of coffee in her hand. She hands him the cup. She looks from him to Joachim, who has gone back to picking at the piano keys. What are you two talking about? Joachim continues to play, turning fully to face Angela. Manu stands up and heads for the kitchen and the back door leading to the courtyard. Rashida is in the barn, feeding a piebald mare an apple. She turns and sees him, her face alight with wonder. She hands him the apple. You can feed her, father, isn't she pretty? Yes. He can see into the living room from where he stands. They are shouting at each other. Joachim is trying to take her arm, but she shakes him off angrily and walks away to the kitchen. Joachim follows her. She leaves the kitchen and heads into the corridor to the bedroom. Come, we have to go now. The horse, father, what of the horse? She asks. She's wearing a pair of Angela's boots. He hugs her tightly. I'm so sorry, child. This was all a mistake. We have to go. But, Rashida, hurry, come on. As they pass through the living room, a door opens and Angela comes out. Manu whispers, sorry, we have to go now. Thanks for everything. You don't have to go. She goes to Rashida and takes her hand. I'm sorry, he says, looking into her eyes. This was a mistake. Rashida looks with perplexity from her father to the woman. Come, Rashida, he says. Their feet landing on the hard snow makes hollow, crunching noises as they leave. I'll stop here.
I'm going to ask a question about Manu before I go back to Gina. I mean, his story is, all of the stories are heart-wrenching, but his is particularly so. Particularly, you see him going back to Checkpoint Charlie again and again, and it's just heartbreaking, and it helps you to imagine the devastation that can happen, to people. But with him and with Karim, so he's Libyan Nigerian, and Karim's family is originally from North Sudan, and they settled in Somalia before he then moves again. And with those two characters, you also examine what it means to move within the continent, how families move and how things then become complicated, particularly for Manu after a crisis begins in Libya. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
I don't know. That's a question, yeah?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just interested in whether that was something you were thinking about deliberately in terms of the fact that even in Libya, after the crisis begins, it's like this place is always known as home is no longer quite home for him?
Yeah, I mean, home is sometimes an arbitrary place, and you think that you're always going to get a better home. I know you want to talk about Manu, but let me go back to the main character, who has no name, which was intentional. I like telling people it's intentional, but it was not intentional. I couldn't think of a name for him. So I finished the first draft. I couldn't think of a name for this character. I did the second draft, still no name. And then I said, okay, maybe he wasn't meant to have a name. He's a person who is traveling, he's trying to reinvent himself. So that's a perfect metaphor for not having a name, for being a cipher, for being somebody who is just, faceless, anonymous. So he and his wife, they have a home in America, but they have a problem. And the belief with all these travelers is that when you leave your home, your problems are going to get kind of magically solved when you go to the next place. And it's not always like that. Because when you go, you face other challenges, and then you have to cope with being an outsider. So it's not just traveling in the West, it's also the same thing. And I think that's the same with Karim's story, who thought that because he's black and his father had been living in Somalia for this long, he belonged there. This was his country, this was all he knew. But then he found out, that they didn't consider him as, one of them. So it's not just in the West. Mm-hmm. It happens in Africa too, I think. Yes. Look at South Africa, what's happening there. Yes. So it's everywhere.
Yes. Yeah. So now back to the main character and Gina. And so they moved to Berlin. This is supposed to be the restorative year for their marriage. And things don't go exactly as planned. And I think, so she's working on a series of photographs, portraits, and she's titled them Travelers. And I found it interesting that is then the title of the book. And I'm going to read a little bit. So this is the flyer she has, the yellow flyer. It said Gina was working on a series of portraits she called Travelers, and she was looking for real migrants to sit for her. And then later on, when Mark comes in and wants to sit for her, she doesn't want Mark. And the main character, the unnamed character, sort of has a sense of why she doesn't want that migrant. And if you don't mind, if I read from your book, I just really like this bit. And he's saying, I knew Gina would love those lines. He's talking about another man who then comes, and he knows that, this is the kind of migrant story, in a sense, that Gina wants to tell. I knew Gina would love those lines, each one of them an eloquent testimony to what he had left behind, to borders and rivers and deserts he had crossed to get to Berlin. She would also love the woman's hands that tightly clutched her daughter's arm. They were dry and scaly, the nails chipped, no doubt ruined while working in some hotel laundry room or has a scullery maid. And this was one part that I kept thinking about after the book, in terms of not just a question of who is, it's interesting that then the book is called Travelers, and the person who's telling the story is not Gina. It's the migrant himself, in a sense, and other migrants as we go along in the novel, and then Matteo towards the end. And it's interesting in terms of who's telling a story and what are they interested in highlighting. And I'm just curious about whether that was a deliberate flipping of using that title of that series, and what your thoughts are around that.
Yeah, so she thinks that, she has an idea of who a traveler or a migrant is in her mind, And to be honest, there isn't one kind of, like, Manu is a doctor, He left home. And the assumption is that people who travel are so poor that they can't live in their countries, which to a large extent is also true. But most of the people who can afford to pay for the passage are actually very rich people. Because sometimes you have to pay like $5,000, $10,000 to be on these boats. So these are people, sometimes they're professionals, PhD holders. They just cannot live in their countries because their countries, they don't feel at home, But the point I was trying to make with her is that we always assume that we want to see this stereotype. So she's looking for visible signs of suffering, that these are the migrants. She wants the wrinkles on the face. Because she's a visual artist, she wants to capture that idea of the traveler. But her husband sees him and is kind of more interested in him for the same reason that she isn't interested in him. So that also shows a little the conflict in the family that I was also trying to capture, because their marriage, is on the rocks. So I wanted to show in subtle ways the little conflicts in the story.
And that really came through. And so we're running out of time, but I wanted to talk about I want to talk about a little bit about some of your other books. And the first question I'm going to ask as we go to that is, this is your 5th book, and I'm just asking for a friend. Have you cracked the code? Like, do you have the formula for, are you going to the next one? I know exactly what I'm going to do.
Yeah, I wish I had. I wish I had like a pill that I can sell. I'll be a millionaire. They say that, with each book you come to it afresh, anew, and you face the same challenges and the doubts, you know, the fear. At the end of the day, you're facing this blank piece of paper. Doesn't matter whether you've written 10 books, when you approach the next one, you're starting from zero. So even if Shakespeare came back today, he's going to face the same doubts and fears when he sits down to write his next play. So it's the same thing. The only difference, I think, with people who have written before and have published before is that you don't have that fear of, you know, whether you're going to get a publisher, you're going to get an agent, and you also don't have that fear of whether you will finish the book, because you've finished books before. And you know the process. You know that you have to be more patient. You have learned some things along the way. But it doesn't make the writing itself easier. You still have to face the characters and make them convincing and make them interesting. So,
okay.
Yeah, don't feel bad
Okay.
with your next book.
Okay. So generally talking about, one final question and then we'll trade open. Talking about your work from Lumber on Poverty Street through Rufus and Zakin, Oil, Water, Chibok Girls, and this, your work has always been engaged with what is political and what is happening right now. I mean, what I've also always loved about it is that it is still a pulsing work of art. It's not an headline. I mean, with Travelers, for instance, it's the people that come alive at the end of the day. The issues are there. It engages with the issues. And I'm just curious about how you manage to intertwine both, I mean, politics and art all through your, all the works you've done so far.
There's an advice that I was given. I remember a long time ago, when I was younger, I had more hair then. We came to Lagos, me and my friend Tony Khan. We wanted to become writers. We went to Professor Obumselu. He had an office somewhere. We went to him and we told him, this is our dream, we want to be writers and all that. Do you have any advice for us? And I still remember what he told us. He said that, well, you want to write novels. My best advice to you is be topical, you know? Find the most topical subject matter and then really go beneath it and try to make your reader see it in a different way. But always try to be topical, always try to be relevant. Then he gave us the example of people like Charles Dickens, who was writing about the most topical issues of the day, like the chimney sweep, you know, the orphans, Oliver Twist and all that. Those were really topical issues. They were political issues. And I think that the writer, especially in African space, has that duty. I don't want to oversimplify it and say that we all have to be political, but we have to be relevant. And it's our duty to make people, to give people hope, yeah? And to show that even the most bleak of the bleakest subject matters can be seen in a different light, you know, it's not all there is to it, there's more to it. So that's what I try to do with my stories. Oil and Water, for instance, is about the Niger Delta. But it's not only that, they're just not victims. There are people who are more than victims, you know. They've taken the volition to do things for themselves. And also to talk about the environment in the process, and to show that there are other communities who are still vibrant and all that. So just try to go beyond the headlines. But I always start with the headlines. I always start with what is topical, what is pressing, because then it's relatable to my readers. They know exactly where I'm coming from, but then I take them a little bit further and show them it's more than that. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So we're going to take questions now. Okay. Is that okay? There's a roving mic.
Hi, Mr. Habila. I've never seen you with hair before in my life. I don't know where you just imagine you had hair. My question actually is about the, I have two questions. The first one is about the migrant experience. Immigrant experience, it seems that it's become a topic that almost all the Nigerian writers living in diaspora, it seems that's what everybody is like talking about these days. And I know you as like a hero, like you're one of the people that made us know that it's possible for us to write as Nigerians, that it's not just the Shoyinkers and the Achebes that can be published. You made this real for us, that we can be writers too. So like coming on the heels of writing about the Chibok girls, and then you now write about Ethiopians and the migrant experience, which from what I've heard is like something that you're actually like you understand the topic very well, you know. So how does that feel? Is it like you had to do it, or you were just tired of the problems in Nigeria and you just want to like write about something different, entirely different? I think those are my two questions: the migrant experience, how it has affected you personally, and why it seems as if a lot of Nigerian writers in the diaspora focus on this experience through other people. Thank you.
Yeah. How do I answer your question? Well, I'll start with my own story. The assumption is that you travel to become a writer, and then everything is fine and good, and you write endlessly without any problem. I remember when I first moved to America. So I was first in England, then I moved to America, and I remember for about 5 years I couldn't write anything. I was just paralyzed. It can be very traumatic, very painful to leave your home. So the first time I left Nigeria, I moved to England, not London, but Norwich. I couldn't even understand what they were saying. Their English was like, I was like, are you speaking English? So imagine that. Then there's the food. Apologies to British people here, but the food was bad, So these are the things that you cope with every day, to be a migrant. It's not just that you're just there harvesting dollars. You are trying to make a life there. And you're also trying to write books. So it's kind of doubly hard for a person like me. Then I moved to America, and like I told you, I couldn't write for 5 years because I didn't know what to write about. Should I write about America? Should I write about Nigeria? I felt I had been removed from Nigeria for a long time now. I couldn't be authentic in a way that a Nigerian who's living in Nigeria would be. And what saved me was, for my next book, I got a phone call from some filmmakers in England. They wanted me to write about the Niger Delta. That was how I ended up writing Oil and Water. I didn't initiate it. It was suggested to me by the film company. They wanted me to write a film script for them. And I wrote the film script, and I realized that, no, this needs to, more treatment. They were focused more on the violence and the kidnapping and the topical issues. And I'm not joking when I tell you that when they wrote to me, the subject was always blood oil, like blood diamonds. They wanted like a blood diamond where some American will come and save Africans. And I didn't see it that way. Then I'll reply, my title for my letters to them is always The River. And when they reply, blood oil, mine is The River. So there was that difference, artistic difference to start with. So when I finished the film script, I decided to write the novel and kind of really go deeper into it. So I'm just showing you how hard it can be. So for travelers, it's not as if I didn't want to set my story in Nigeria, but I wanted to write about this subject matter. And it has to be outside Nigeria. And I think African literature has reached a stage now where we are pushing the boundaries, we are redefining what it means, what Africa means. So when I write about Africans in Europe, I'm writing about Africa because it's the African experience. It has transcended the boundaries. I'm kind of challenging the idea of the borders that were drawn by the European powers and basically were put in these countries almost as if it's a prison. You're dumped here in this country that was never meant to succeed. It's almost as if we are just here. These countries were created so that they will have natural resources. They just come here to take their natural resources. Basically, that's it. So when you write about Africans traveling, doing other things, you are expanding the boundaries of your own country and talking about the African experience outside of Africa, and it's still authentic. So I like the new trend of Africans writing about those places because they are claiming it the way the Joseph Conrads came and claimed Africa. We're also kind of claiming that space. We're inscribing ourselves into these spaces. Yeah.
Yes, Franklin. Oh, okay. Franklin then.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Franklin. Hello, Helon. First of all, I'm a big fan of your work. From the days when I used to steal money to buy hints. I don't know if there are people around my age who are here. So I used to steal my mom's. Then hints was 17 naira.
Should have said that.
Too much information.
So 17 naira. And I used to read that every week. So there was you, there was Tony Khan, there was Chidima Agu, I think so. So you started as a journalist, more or less. And so does it affect your fiction? Because I'm also seeing that some sort of similarity in also the styles of some of your colleagues as well who went on to write fiction. I see that. So does it affect how you write your stories? Or do you think if you didn't start out as a journalist, you'd have written differently?
I don't know. I mean, writing for Hints magazine was like my creative writing school. You know, that's where I went to school. I don't have an MFA, for instance. I read literature. So when I got to Hints magazine, I was the stories editor at that time. My duties was to generate stories, to acquire stories, and they didn't care where I got the stories from. So I could get it from people who would come and tell me. We had lots of people who would come and tell us true stories. Of course, we had to tweak it and shorten it sometimes and change a few things and make them interesting. So I had to submit, I think, 4 stories every month. And sometimes I wouldn't get people to come and tell me stories, so I had to write them. So I was writing stories, 4 short stories every month for the time I was at Hints magazine. So I was basically practicing. And that's what we do in the MFA. That's what we teach students. To teach creative writing is not to open somebody's brain and put creative writing into it. Basically, you get people to sit in a room and they write stories and they workshop it. And the idea is for them to learn how to rewrite and rewrite and rewrite. That's what I was doing. I was playing with stories at Hints magazine. So that gave me a certain style. And the emphasis was on clarity. Yes. At Hints magazine. Above everything else, you have to be clear about what you're saying. And that's also what we tell our students in the MFA. What does this mean? You know, what are you trying to say here? Could you maybe find a better word? Can you rephrase this sentence? That's what I was doing. So I don't know if I had gone to MFA school, maybe my writing would have been different. I don't think so. You know, the thing is to have models as well, because I had my models that I wanted to write like. I was reading quite a lot. So I had a few people that I wanted to be like. But above everything else, just write an interesting story and to make it clear. Yeah. I hope that answers your question.
Okay.
All right. Hi, Helen. So I read Measuring Time, and I feel good that you took us way back to, correct me if I'm wrong, Gombe State, right? So I just wanted to know what impacts background and the hometown where you grew up, and probably the region, how much it informed your writing and how it helped you to write the way you actually write.
My background, where I came from?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I'm beginning to be very old now. He was reading me when he was a baby, stealing from his mother. I grew up listening to folk tales, like most people probably, you know, in Nigeria. So we had this grandmother who would tell us folk tales. And then I was in primary school, and we had like a lesson, like a period in class where you have to stand up and tell the story in vernacular. Not in English, in vernacular. So basically what I was doing was to retell the stories that she told me. You know, she would tell us the stories in the night, then we would come to school and we tell the story in front of class. I was like the champion. For some reason, I was quite good at it. They would actually take me from class to class to tell stories. I was a child prodigy for storytelling. But then, of course, I graduated to reading, and also, but not in English, in Hausa. I started reading in Hausa first, before I even learned how to read in English. I read in Hausa. And I was reading all these books like Iliad, Mekarfi, Deredubu, all these books. My father had boxes of them, so I started reading from there. But it gave me a kind of understanding of life, stories. And most people who become writers will tell you that they found some kind of meaning, a kind of logic in stories. There's a beginning, there's a middle, there's an ending. Things make sense. And the writing itself becomes like your universe. It becomes like your world. But I never met a writer in my life. When I was growing up, I never saw a writer until I went to university. But by then I knew what I wanted to do. But of course I read sciences in secondary school. I didn't read literature till I went to university. I converted to the arts because I wanted to be a writer. So that's really how my background sort of informed my development as a writer. Yeah.
Okay, so there are two people in front, and then I think we will need to stop.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Ayodele. Yeah. As Ayobami had noted earlier, you admitted to being a political writer. My question is, do you bother about representation when writing these things? I mean, an Hausa man writing about the Niger Delta, that's as complicated as this one. Do you bother about how you represent people? And thanks for your tribute to Marikera, Dambuto Marikera. I think it was in the VQR. That thing is very solid.
Are you Hausa?
I'm not Hausa, by the way.
Oh, okay. So
I speak Hausa.
Oh, you speak Hausa.
It's my first language, but I'm not Hausa.
Oh, okay. And even the migrant travelers now, do you bother about how you represent people, the different characters in the migrant experience? I mean, there's a whole lot of people involved.
Yeah, I mean, it's complicated. There's a lot of discussion around it about writing across differences and all that. But as long as you do it respectfully, you do it with sincerity. You do it. You don't do it lightheartedly. You don't take it lightly. You take it seriously. I don't see why you shouldn't write about others. After all, if we don't, that's what we do as writers. Our work is to imagine the other and to represent and to try to go beyond the stereotype. So I have no problem with it. If I was writing about a white person, I wouldn't keep talking about how white he is. I would just tell you if he's a good singer or a good dancer or a good father or a good mother, That's basically what I would do. I wouldn't focus on what makes him different. I would focus on what makes him human. We're trying to illustrate the human condition, and we need to go to the heart of what it means to be human.
Okay. So the final question. One final normal question.
So, hi, my name is Oilala. So my question has, I feel like you could give a lot of insight to this, particularly because of a lot of the topics you write on really deals with identity. And I feel like as someone that travels a lot, and from people I've spoken to from different cultures and from different spaces, they seem to always, like when you go into space, your identity can either be an asset or a curse. But a lot of people I speak to see it as a curse. They mostly kind of use it to impress people because when you tell a white person you're from Africa, they're like, oh wow. So that type of thing. So I wanted to know through your experiences, what you think about identity. What would you consider it?
Okay, are you saying, sorry, is it a blessing or a curse to go to a new place, or is thoughts around identity?
I'm saying, do you think identity is a blessing or a curse?
Oh,
yeah.
Okay. Is identity a blessing or a curse?
Identity, how can it be a curse? It's who you are. And of course there's our situation. Let me use a specific example of our African environment. So we had the interaction with colonialism, and the whole purpose of colonialism is to make you feel kind of to hate your identity, or to hate who you are, or to make you feel inferior. So if you believe in that, if you take that education and you internalize it, it makes you feel bad that maybe there's something wrong with you, But I think identity is something that you should understand who you are. Like Chinua Achebe said, you have to know where the rain began to beat you before you can, know where you're coming from. So I think everybody should have, especially writers, I think you have to really go into your culture to understand what other writers in the same tradition have written, and to really read within that tradition and to understand it, then you will be proud of who you are, because there's always something positive about, no matter where you come from or who you are, there always is something good in it, because it has enabled you to survive. Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming for this. Most importantly, thank you for clapping, but most importantly, go and buy the book. That's why we are here. It's a fantastic book. I could go on and on about it. It's really well crafted, and it's got all these wonderful stories in it. Please get a copy. You'll be signing outside. Thank you for coming for this panel. Have a good afternoon.
Please give them another round of applause. These are Wida Books authors.